Brothers and sisters, the Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark. Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Then Elijah appeared to them, along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say. They were so terrified. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. From the cloud came a voice. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus alone with them. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone, except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what raising from the dead meant. The Gospel of the Lord. Good morning, everyone. Good little show of hands. Okay, you have to raise your hand which one you agree with. Who thinks the dress was gold and white? Okay, raise your hand. Good. Who thinks that stupid dress was black and blue? Okay, get out of here. It's gold and white. Okay, this is a no-brainer. Okay, it's gold and white. It's clearly obvious. But it's gone viral, hasn't it? It starts with a little dress in England, goes to Tumblr, and then people for 48 hours have been discussing what color the dress is. Anyway, you know what? Mark is trying to convey something to us in the Gospel today, and he's going to be focusing on the clothes that Jesus wears. He's going to be talking, he's going to tell us about the clothes that Jesus wears. So we'll get back to that in a minute. Last week, we Catholics began the season of Lent. And on the first Sunday of Lent, we always read the same story from the Gospels. It's Jesus' temptation for 40 days in the desert. This year, we're reading mostly from the Gospel of St. Mark. So last week, we heard Mark's version of this. Next year, we're going to hear Luke's version of it. The following year, we hear Mark's version of it, and then we come back to Matthew's version, then we come back to Mark's version. And we always reflect on those 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert dealing with sin and Satan and temptation. Because that's what we're called to do during the 40 days of Lent. It's our 40 days in the desert where we have to deal with sin and temptation and the devil in our lives. This is the second Sunday of Lent. And on the second Sunday of Lent, we Catholics always hear the same story. It's the transfiguration of Jesus. This year we hear Mark's version of it. Next year, Luke's version of it. The following year, Matthew's version of it. And then we come back to Mark's version again. Okay. So let's talk about this mystery that we call the Transfiguration. You know, up until this point in St. Mark's Gospel, Jesus has been up north in this area of Israel called Galilee. And that's where he's been working miracles and preaching and performing exorcisms. But Jesus knows that his ministry can't stay there. Jesus knows that his divine destiny is going to lead him to the city of Jerusalem. That's where Jesus knows he will ultimately fulfill his mission. Not in Galilee, in Jerusalem. And Jesus knows that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer an horrific death. It's just going to be an horrific death. But Jesus begins the journey. So Jesus is walking toward Jerusalem, and he goes up onto a mountain with his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to pray. And then it's almost like, in order to strengthen Jesus to endure that divine destiny, he must endure in Jerusalem. God the Father does something to him. You know, we call this the Transfiguration, but it's like God's glory comes right into Jesus, and something happens to him physically. It's like God's life and God's energy and God's splendor indwells Jesus and fills him up. And, you know, Mark tells us even what happens to his clothes. Mark says his clothes became dazzling white. Whiter than any bleacher or any fuller on earth could have ever made them. It's like the glory of God comes into Jesus, and it's like he glows or he shimmers or he becomes iridescent with God's glory. If that's not enough, the two greatest people in the Old Testament appear talking to Jesus. Moses appears, and Moses represents the law that God had given to the Jewish people. And then Elijah appears, and Elijah is the greatest of all the prophets. And Moses and Elijah are both speaking to Jesus Christ. And all this is going on. And it's like Peter, James, and John are just flabbergasted. And Peter, who tends to be a little spontaneous and impetuous, really doesn't know what to say. And he just kind of blurts out, Jesus, it's great that you're here. Let me build a tent or a hut or a little building for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And Mark says, like, Peter didn't know what to say. He was so terrified. So he just decides to build things. You know? And all of a sudden, it all disappears, and everything is quiet. It all disappears. And Jesus is there alone. Peter, James, and John. Now, this is kind of interesting. Jesus says what he often says in Mark's Gospel. Jesus kind of wags his finger there at Peter, James, and John and says, do not tell anyone what you have just seen. And we know that Jesus says that a lot to people in the Gospel of Mark. Because people misunderstand Jesus. They really don't understand the full Jesus. Jesus says, don't you dare tell anyone until you see the Son of Man crucified on a cross on Good Friday and raised from the dead. And once people see Jesus Christ crucified, then Jesus says to the disciples, then you can go and tell everyone about it. And you almost have Jesus feeling like, you know, and then let's see how many people will follow me. Like Jesus is saying, oh, they'll follow the Son of Man as long as I continue to just crank out those miracles. And they'll follow the Son of Man glorified on a mountain. But will they follow the Son of Man when they see him crucified? And when they know that that might be their fate as well. So Jesus is very sober in John, in Luke's, in Mark's Gospel. Now, as spectacular as all these things are, the most important part of the Gospel this morning is what God says. God speaks. The cloud comes over, it casts a shadow, they look up at the cloud, and from the cloud, God says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." That's the most important part of the gospel. And being a disciple of Jesus Christ means listening to him and being obedient to him and obeying his teachings. And to be honest, we don't like the word obedience today. You know, when we're told to obey, we're all like little kids. But obedience is a big part of mature Christian discipleship. Discipleship, for people to take this seriously, requires obedience to Jesus Christ. And that's the point of the gospel today. I think if I had to summarize it just in a short sentence that you could tweet out there, it would be: discipleship requires obedience to Jesus Christ. Discipleship requires obedience to Jesus Christ. Be merciful, O Lord, for we have sinned. 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 You know, way back in the book of Genesis, when God creates Adam and Eve, God tells Adam and Eve to obey him and do not eat from the tree. And Adam and Eve disobeyed, and they ate from the tree. And that disobedience is what we call sin. And during the season of Lent, we acknowledge that all of us have sinned as well. We ask God to be merciful, for we have sinned. So this is what I'm going to ask everybody to do during this coming week. You know, being obedient to Jesus Christ and his teachings and his values sometimes requires us to be disobedient to the values, the institutions, the people in our culture and in our society. Sometimes being obedient to Jesus Christ requires disobedience to those things or those people or those values that are in contradiction to the values of Jesus Christ. I'm asking everybody this week to be disobedient to those values that are contrary to Jesus Christ. Be disobedient to those values that are contrary to Jesus Christ. Now, there are some really wonderful, beautiful, moral things in our culture and in our society today. And then we celebrate. And we thank God for the privilege of living in our society and in our culture. But there are a lot of values, sometimes even people, institutions, organizations, that are contrary to our Catholic faith. And this week I'm asking all of us not to obey them, to disobey those values and institutions and messages that are contrary to the gospel message. Sometimes we Catholic Christians are called to embrace our culture. But sometimes, and unfortunately more and more, we're called to be countercultural. We're called to resist our culture and our society. This week, I'm asking you to resist, to reject, to disobey, so that we're free to obey the teachings of Christ. Now, I don't know what that looks like for you. I don't know the form or the shape of your holy disobedience this week. I know what it looks like for me. But I'm encouraging all of you to a holy disobedience this week. Now, Jesus did this in his life. Jesus was always obedient to the teachings of God the Father and the promptings of the Holy Spirit, but sometimes that required that Jesus was disobedient to some of the values and traditions and habits and customs and even religious practices of his day. Again, this week, be disobedient to those values that oppose Jesus Christ. And if we practice that type of holy disobedience, I think we'll be following the example of Christ, and we'll be putting our gospel into practice this week. Be merciful, O Lord, for we have sinned. 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 Our Lenten and Holy Week schedule is in the bulletin and on our website. This weekend is Casserole Sunday, so we're asking you, if you can, to take tins that are in the cabinets in the freezer room and help prepare a meal for the homeless for that Seder project. St. Peter of Paul Parish is going to be offering an 8-week summer camp, so there's information on our website as well. Please return the filled baby bottles to the baskets in the lobby of the church to support Birthright. And our annual school fundraiser will be held at the Desmond Hotel Saturday evening, March 28th. And everybody in the parish and friends of yours are welcome to attend. The tickets will be sold downstairs in the church hall